pre-order my book in the description below. There is a very strong unwillingness in the Paper Mario community to come out and acknowledge that Paper Mario, the Thousand Year Door on Nintendo Switch is indeed a disappointment. They botched the script, they botched the visuals, they botched the gameplay, the pacing is off, jokes don't land. The reality is, this is, objectively speaking, a worse version of the original game, right? There are some nice additions. They fix some of the pacing problems. They have a boss fight I've been waiting to see for 20 years. But the long and short of it, as someone who grew up loving the original, I fell out of love with it years ago. But like, as someone who grew up and played the original and really, really loved it back in the day, like this did nothing to revitalize my love for Paper Mario. If anything, it really demonstrates what we've lost, right? This game really shows how far the localization industry has fallen. Because back in the day, the team behind localizations would put a lot of time and effort into making sure that the new version of the game internally makes sense and wouldn't arbitrarily make changes in order to push some weird political agenda, right? There are several lines in Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door on Nintendo Switch that are changed purely to like push uh super neoliberal woke values, right? It's not just like the whole pretending Vivian is trans thing. He's not. But like you have Bowser saying that like, ooh, Peach is a strong silent type. Like, what? Like you just have like things like that. Like you have just characterization is all over the place. Like there are weird additions. Like Coop's dad, Cooply, like he specifically says in this version that he fell for Hooktail's feet thing, which it to me is like one of the most depraved, disgusting things like they could have possibly done. Like to me, like I was hoping they would remove the foot thing from this version. That was one of those things that I was just like, yeah, that shouldn't fly today. Like again, they had the opportunity to fix some of the weird, cringy aspects of the original, and they just didn't do it. Instead, they doubled down on like weird stuff that doesn't make any sense. They uh they botched everything the original had going for it in order to to just do this, right? And to me, I do think this is like an example of like truly terrible localization. And of course, like the community is not getting up in arms about this because of course like the censorship community isn't actually concerned about the declining quality of video game localizations. They're mostly just concerned about like making sure that like the lolicon characters aren't desexualized, right? Like they don't actually care about like artistic integrity and producing a good story and doing doing a good job, right? Essentially. Like this is, I think, by far the worst localization I've seen in a Nintendo game. Like in any Nintendo game, especially because it was already localized. To me, it made no sense to do any kind of rewrite. Like if you were going to make any changes at all, like there were things you could do, there were things you could adjust, right? Again, again, I would not have minded like removing the hooktail feet thing, right? Like again, there are things that like I definitely don't wouldn't mind being removed, right? Again, I'm actually a very big supporter of the idea that they should have like a continued the original English localization decision to make Vivian an actual female. I think the story makes more sense that way, right? But again, like he's a guy in this version, and I don't really mind that in and of itself. But again, this is why localization exists. Like you have to like keep your target culture in mind in regards to like things that you're bringing over, and there are some changes that need to be made. For example, this is something I did not know. The reason why in the original localization Hooktail's weakness was crickets was because like in the Japanese version her weakness was frogs, right? So Japanese frogs sound nothing like American frogs. So they made the decision to change the weakness to crickets instead, which again makes perfect sense. It's a decision that they had to come to, even if it makes no sense that like a dragon would eat a cricket. Like it's just like really. But anyway, uh, uh, there were things that needed to be changed, right? Like again, like this is a good example of how localization isn't always bad, right? You know, the new localization changes the weakness back to frogs, right? Because now they have the technology to change the sound effect of the badge, right? So they change it so it sounds more like an American frog, right? To me, like why even like go to that length, right? Like again, like there were changes that could have been made, right? There are changes that make sense. There are changes that like the game in some ways is like more accurate than the original. But then there are like weird like deviations from it that are just very, very, very noticeable that really need to be condemned, right? And I do think chief among them is the whole Vivian thing, but again, Vivian is not trans. He is a crossdresser, an Otonoka, the term is. But to me, I do think this is an example of just what exactly the localization industry is doing wrong, right? To me, the localizers today don't respect continuity. They can't keep their characterization straight. They they don't have the ability uh, to do nuance or create compelling, interesting characters. Like again, this is a really interesting point. Like it's canon that Beldam is like abusive to Vivian, right? Like it's canon that like Beldam really is abusive towards him, right? That's a core aspect of both their characters, right? And yet you're gonna try and tell me that Beldam doesn't address the fact that Vivian is male in this version of the game at all. Like to me, like again, like the entire point of the change was to try to paint this image of like, the Mario cast are all very accepting of trans people. Even Beldam is supportive. But like the reality is, the implication is that like Beldam is the one that's enabling this behavior. That she is the abusive groomer who gaslit Vivian into thinking he's a girl, right? That's the implication. Now the localization team didn't think about this, right? You know, the audience hasn't been thinking about this, right? The people who are like worshiping Vivian as some trans icon haven't thought about this, but this is the implication, right? It is very much another Bridget in that regard, where the changes made to an established character, right, create some very, very unfortunate implications, like to the narrative that like the localizers want to push, right? And to me, I do think like this is an example of just how Treehouse right now is getting away with murder in regards to like pronoun usage and pretending that certain characters are trans when they're not. Because there have been several examples of this over the past couple of years. You know, I've talked about Juniper for Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and how she isn't a they them. Like, you know, this is easily proven in game. Like, I talked about Oct and how she's like clearly a girl in Japan. Like, it has something to do with like the pronoun usage. Like, in Japan, like, their gender pronouns are a lot less rigid than English ones. So like sometimes like girls tend to use like more masculine things. It doesn't mean anything. It just means that like she's a certain archetype of character. But yeah. Uh and now we're seeing like this weird like attempting at co-opting Vivian. And I really do applaud like the actual Paper Mario fan base because there has been like a very outspoken audience of people who have come out like in against the whole like Vivian is trans thing. Like this is a narrative that the trans community has been trying to push since like 2004, right? Like, ooh, Vivian is trans. Like this is something that's been going on for 20 years. And to think that like the localizers have infiltrated Nintendo, tried to pass it off as canon, and then like, you know, people like me immediately came out and were just like, no, that's not true. Like that's crazy to me that happened. At the very least, like again, like we grew up being told that like, ooh, we grew up knowing that Vivian was a man in the Japanese version. So like to see people like try and flip that, like try to say that like, oh, she's trans actually. That it just doesn't fly, you know. Like it really is like to me, this really demonstrates just how difficult it's going to be for localizers to ruin brands going forward because nothing they do is internally consistent. That's the thing. They make weird changes like this, but then they have to contend with like the original English localization. They have to contend with the Japanese version, both the new one and the updated one, both the new one and the old one, right? They have to deal with like other Mario games, right? So like when you see Bowser go to Petalburg Village like looking for Princess Peach, and then he sees that poster, and then he says his stupid line, right? You know, one of the worst changes in the game that I've noticed, right? Like you instantly you're just like that's not something Bowser would actually say. Strong silent type, really? Like again, like the line in the original where he says that he actually likes the idea that uh, Peach doesn't talk. You know, that emphasizes that Bowser as a character doesn't value Peach as a person and sees her as an object, right? Like that is, I think, an essential part of the character, and they butchered it, right? Completely butchered it. Like it's it's just it's just ridiculous to see. And it's and again, this is amazing because this happened immediately after Super Mario RPG, which was extremely faithful in comparison. Right? Like I was really surprised with how like Mario RPG preserved Peach's character in that one. Considering how like feminine and demure she is, like considering the things that happened in that game, I really thought they would make some kind of changes to it. But no, like it was uh fairly accurate to the original. Uh, I don't know. Like, I wonder if like the localization decisions for the Thousand Year Door specifically were because of its like terminally online autistic audience, right? That seems to be like my that seems to be like that's in my opinion that seems to be why this happened because they weren't able to get away with a lot of crazy changes, right? But there were a few and they were noticeable and they were terrible. And that in and of itself is enough reason to condemn the Nintendo localization team, the people who work on this game. Like whoever is behind this needs to be fired immediately. Is my honest, like, genuine opinion about this. And I have every intention over the next several years to try and learn my hiragana, trying to learn how to read Japanese because I'm completely done at this point. I have no like expectation that things are going to get better on the localization side of things, so I have every intention of switching over to the Japanese version. I would have done it a long time ago if I had the time to study, but as it is now, I'm just gonna have to like I don't know, just gradually learn. And it's gonna be difficult switching over. I'll probably just like switch my Switch over to Japan and then like start playing older games in Japanese and slowly work my way up. But like again, the fact that this like keeps happening is appalling, honestly. And I do think fans have an obligation to call this nonsense out and to address the YouTubers who enable it. Because I know Game Explain has come out like in support of the decision. I'm sure Arlo is. I've seen a couple of other YouTubers do it. Don't trust them. Don't believe them. Like they are complete and total shills.